I'm going to crack open Photoshop here, and getting started right away, I'm going to give this a name first and foremost. It's always important to kind of start off on the right foot. Helps in saving. So I'm just going to call this the Retouching Test Piece underscore version 1, because of course in the advertising world there's always more than one version. I like to start off at a square format. I'll explain more why later. I'm going to go to a nice hefty 30 inches by 30 inches at 300 dpi and at RGB. CMYK is preferred for later, but RGB is better for building, so we'll go with that for now. Background can be remained as white, and the color profiles, the ICC profiles here are all default, and we're going to leave the sRGB, which is Photoshop's initial default setting. Square pixels also a default setting, we're going to leave it at that. And okay. So while this opens up, I'm going to position my canvas a little bit. There are some hotkeys I think you should get to know on the keyboard, but we'll start with the basics for now. And before I get too far, I'm just going to save my Photoshop, my PSD file, to my desktop just so I know where it's at, and make saving a little bit easier. Alright, so first things first, I'm going to go looking for some assets to build into my image here. Of course, you got to start with something. Now, in the perfect world, if you are doing this for a client, you're already going to have assets, so the part that I'm doing now is just basically looking for stuff to use. To begin this tutorial with. If you are working with a photographer or for a client, you normally wouldn't be searching for your own product and your own photos for that product, but hopefully they'd be supplied to you, of course. That would be the more expected way of working. So I'm just going to delve into some of my old photography here and kind of get myself started. As you probably saw, I'm working into the Bentley Motors folder. They are a client that I've worked on before in the past, and if you are in a setting such as this and you'd like to try to gain some of your own assets, I found this particular image just through a Google search. It's an older model, and I'm going to zoom in on it real quick, show you the settings. 22 by 16 roughly. It's 72 dpi. That will be a problem. It doesn't make a difference really how big the image is. This is more of an average size despite what Google says, and I'm going to copy and paste this file into my canvas so you can see how tiny it came in. And if I'm going to expand this to an average size, I'd like to zoom in out here and show you the edge quality. It's not horrible, but it's not great. This isn't what I'd really call a proof or a print ready piece. The background is a little pixelated, a little bicubic breakdown. I'm going to go grab now from an older retouched image that I put together several years ago, or that I worked on at least, and open this one up and kind of show you side-by-side comparison. If you're in high def mode here in YouTube, you'll see that the edges are pretty pixelated. There's a lot of stepping happening, especially in the white lines that you're seeing on the image of the hood. I'm going to bring in this original now. This was an image that I'd worked with in the past, and it's obviously already been retouched and put into an environment, a very simple one, but still there'll be some areas here that I want to kind of point out. So I copy and paste this into the same canvas. A little bit large, you can already tell by how long it's taking to paste. And this is going to come in at roughly larger than the other, well, definitely larger than the last one, but to the size that I'm looking at it to be. Reorganize my workspace a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in kind of in the same general area. You'll see that I have a very clean edge here. There's some pixelization, but I've zoomed in so far that is to be expected. But I'm really looking more for cleanliness of tones, making sure that nothing has been destroyed in the copy and pasting process, as well as what may have happened during a previous save. Okay, I'm going to delete the older file, and I'm going to make sure I name my layer here, try to keep myself organized as long as possible. Alright, kind of zooming into the back end, I'm now going to point out the paths. I'm currently in my layers palette. I'm going to rejoin this with my dialogues down here and switch over to the paths palette. You'll notice the paths palette is empty at the moment. There's nothing there. As soon as I use my pen tool, as I just did, and clicked once, the very first point that I make automatically created a work path in italics, the blue one over here on the right. You'll see it in my paths palette there. That's an automatic function. It automatically pops into place when you start using a vector tool in the world of Photoshop. More about that in a minute. So as I'm using my paths or my pen tool, I'm just going to drag around the outside of the contour here. I've zoomed in fairly close enough that I can see a nice clean edge between the background and the vehicle's edge. I'm doing my best to make sure that my line is going to follow precisely, as close as I can, that break. I don't want to be too far into the red of the paints of the car or too far into the background itself. I want this to be effectively a digital version of an X-Acto blade that follows as cleanly and as closely as possible around this vehicle contour, because of course I'm going to be using this path to trim the car out as soon as I'm done with it. It's also worth stating, if you have not used the pen tool before, it's worth getting used to it because it is a very powerful tool. It is one that has a lot of function, and if you're the variety of person that likes to use the marquee tools or the selection tools instead of the pen tool, I'd really ask you to try to rethink that. The rationale behind it, of course, is that once I'm done with this, as you'll see in a moment, the path that I build using the pen tool is a semi-permanent feature. It's not going to be something I'm going to have to do over and over again, which is not true of the selection tools or the marquee tools, because of course no matter how clean or precise you are with that tool, once it's deselected, it's pretty much gone, and you have to do it all over again. Okay, so I'm just kind of working through here. Alright, so as I'm going around the outside here, I'd like to make points that, again, the pen tool, in my best estimation, is one that is relatable to an X-Acto blade's edge. And the reason I mention that is because the path that I'm building right now it's an imaginary line. It is not making a mark of any kind on the actual canvas. It is nothing more than vector points and paths that are here to facilitate selection and other functions later down the line. And I called it an X-Acto blade edge because a vector path or a vector shape by its very nature is nothing more than math. It will be infinitely clean regardless of how much I zoom in or how far I move away, how much I expand it or how much I shrink it. It will always be super clean. It is not subject to pixelization like the rest of the raster image is itself. So thinking of it in that way, it's important to be as precise as possible as I go around this outer edge. For now, I'm just kind of pointing out, as I mentioned a moment ago, that I am throwing in a new layer here, and the reason I'm doing that is because now that I'm getting my path and I'm building down towards the bottom, the shadows of where the tires meet the ground are getting so dark that I couldn't really see where the edge of the vehicle really was. So I added a temporary levels layer that allowed me to expand the color quite a bit, or I should say the levels of the contrast quite a bit. So now that I've blown it all out, I can see the edges quite clearly. This is a temporary thing. You'll see me delete it in a moment here, but here you can actually see that it's a lot easier to see the edge of the car. It's also worth noting that the shadow doesn't seem to be making any sense down here. So this is something that's been residually left over from previous retouch where the shadow wasn't quite built accurately. Here too you can see like there's an odd bit of black around the outside of the vehicle, which clearly makes it feel like it's been clipped out. I'll adjust this point here. Alright. Since I'm on the wheels, it's worth mentioning that you can create a perfect circle with only 4 points using the pen tool. Try as best you can to make sure that your paths are as clean and as smooth as you can. You don't need 1,000 little points all creating 1,000 little arcs to get a perfect circle. It's really the fewer points the better, especially on something like this that is a product where the curves are not as organic as a person's face per se. They are very predictable. A wheel especially is for the most part a near perfect ellipse. Alright, almost there, kind of going around the back side now of the vehicle, getting closer to where I left off. You'll see me clicking on these points too, and it kills the leading handle. I'm doing that by holding down on Mac the Option key. Alright, here we go, and now I have joined the two pieces together, and I should have a nice continuous shape that represents my vehicle. You'll see over here in the Paths palette, I'm just going to name this vehicle contour, which I spelled wrong. Let's try that again. There we go. And that's it. So I did that because when I named it, it now becomes, until I deleted it anyway, a permanent part of this file. If I left it in its italics or where it said work path, that is a temporary file. If I were to leave the path that I was currently building and then started a new path, that work path would have been deleted and it would have been overwritten by the path that I was building second. I don't want that. Clearly I want to keep this path of the vehicle, which I built on purpose for this reason, so I gave it a name. And that automatically makes it a permanent layer feature. Okay, so let's see. Next I need to do some more path building. Usually with vehicles, I tend to look at, this is a basic, bare minimum, 3-path or 3 paths job. The first being the contour of the vehicle itself, and the next 2 that I'm going to have to build are going to be for the glass of the windows, and then one for the shadow. I'm going to start with the glass first. It's just a little bit more time consuming, so I want to make sure that I have that one out of the way. And as I mentioned, I want my paths to be as clean and as few points as I possibly can, so I want to make sure that it started with the far right edge over here, and then I'm adjusting this path so that it's just one long arc from one corner of the window to the next. I'm already familiar through experience with the limitations of curves and the angles that are allowed through natural curvilinear qualities of this pen tool, so I know how far I can really take this point before it becomes a problem and starts to break weird. So I'm kind of doing the best I can here to follow those areas. There's a little bit of an odd curve here, so I'm going to follow this along. Get around the other side now. It's a little strange. Oh, that's right. Okay. To adjust this a little bit. There we go. Okay, I'm going to kill that handle. Bring this back down. And that should complete this window. It's worth mentioning here also that I'm only trying to trim out the glass, not any of the rubber edges. Make this a little bigger so you can see what I'm doing. Alright, so you should see the 2 paths now, one for the vehicle on top and the next one which currently says work path because I have not given it a name yet. And what I did here was you'll see that now my work path is reset. I had the window originally built for the windshield, and then I moved over and started a new path. And when I did, I lost the one I did for the windshield. That was because I didn't give it a name. So simply by giving it a name, it doesn't have to be anything, it doesn't have to be a specific name, just anything, as long as you title it on some level, then I'll have this path back as a permanent feature. So now that I've moved back and I've just reestablished that, so I might have my windshield back, and I'm going to continue moving along on the glass portions of the side passenger window. Again, noting that I'm only taking the glass. Of course, that includes the shadow on the glass, but this is the glass itself, and not any of the molding. There's a specific reason for that, of course, which I'll get to in the next sections here, but kind of jumping ahead, the rationale is that I am only looking to rebuild the glass itself when the time becomes necessary. And that being said, if I need to put a glare or any kind of shading or anything on the glass, it isn't going to behave the same way on the molding that it would on the glass itself. Clearly the glass is more reflective and more subject to transparency and things like that than the molding would be, so it wouldn't make any sense for me to grab the molding. I'm only looking for just the glass. So here again, kind of coming around the corner here, this one's got a lot of little pieces. Doing a diligent job, make sure I go around the side view mirror. And again, this is taking a bit of time, but it is meant to. This is something that, even though I am fairly going quicker than I probably normally would, this process is going to be something that we are going to hold on to. It's going to be the paths that we are generating here are going to be part of this file, and we'll continue using them through the life of this project. So if we rush this now, as I just did here. Let's get this back where it should be. If you rush this process and you wind up with paths that aren't true to form, you're going to wind up with weird breaks and color flubs and things that don't make sense as we move down the line on this process. Okay, so I got the glass, and all I'm really seeing is the front and the side, so that's good enough. I don't need the headlights or anything. That's not really what I'm after, at least not at this point. I'm going to name this. Let's call that glass. And then we're going to have one final path, and that is going to be now down here for the shadow. Now the shadow is tricky, and it can be tricky depending on what angle you're working with. This is a nice low 3/4 angle, so I get a pretty good idea of what the shadow should look like. I can see it for the most part, so I'm just going to go around the outside. The shadows usually have some level of feathering and blurred edges to them. I'm not concerned with that. I'm just taking the core of the shadow, just following the form itself, and I'm making sure that I'm really keeping that trapezoidal feeling of the vehicle. Now this shadow, I'm dealing with a little bit of a what-if scenario here because the shadow is artificial. It was created from a previous retouch, so I need to make a couple of adjustments to make sure that the light is generating an appropriate shadow. You can see that it's sticking out far to the left over here, and it's not so far on the right. I'm just going to add in the missing side view mirror here. You got two overlapping paths, not a problem. You'll see over here on the right of the front of the vehicle, the path is very inset from the front of the vehicle. It's not quite sticking out far enough in my opinion. Let me pull this out. I did this simply by using the white arrow that's in the lower half of the toolbar, right below the T or text tool. The black arrow, conversely, that same location, will move the whole path. The white arrow moves just parts of the path or just points within the path. It's a very convenient tool. Alright, so I'm going to name this. Let's call this shadow. And now I'm going to move on to the next stage, which is going to be first deleting this unnecessary levels path that I built. And now going back to my paths, if I hold down the option key, or the command key, excuse me, on the Mac world, and if I click on the thumbnail portion of the path, it'll automatically make a selection of the vehicle path I just created. And when I did that, now I go back to my layers palette here, and I'm going to copy and paste from my original artwork the vehicle on top. You'll see in my layer stack here I have 3 layers now, an empty white one, the original artwork, and now the clipped out car floating on top of the original. I don't really need to copy or paste any other elements because I'm going to be recreating the shadow. So down here I'm just going to make a selection for the shadow using that same command click technique on the path thumbnail. Just going to name this real quick. Apparently I cannot spell while I'm talking. Let's try that again. There we go. And alright, coming back here. What am I looking for? Going back to the original. I want to, below my vehicle on the empty layer now, I'm going to simply fill this layer, or this path that I just made, with solid black. Let's make it solid black. That looks a little chalky to me. There we go. And I really don't honestly need the original artwork anymore. Now there will be some stages coming up where it would have been nice to hold on to this, but I want to show you kind of how to build things from scratch. So let's just, for argument's sake, delete this layer and start with a very virgin scene. So here we go, basically a very crisp shadow, which we will modify later. And now moving into the core of it. This last quarter of the video that we're working on right now, at least this episode, is going to be building the grid. So I don't know if you just saw what I just did. I was up at the very top of the screen. I clicked under filters and there is an option called vanishing point. When you click on it, you get this general scene. It's, depending on how large artwork is, it may take a few moments to load, as mine did. And it will show you basically your canvas. The vanishing point filter is a unique one. It sets up a whole new canvas and a whole new set of tools which are tricky to use. What I need to do with this tool is I am going to try to establish my vanishing point. Vehicles are tricky because they're not traditionally square or rectangular. They may appear that way on some basic level, but there's a lot of curvilinear lines and angles and curves and things to this that don't make it very easy to figure out perspective. So I have found that using where the 4 tires physically touch the ground is the best place to get your perspective from. As I just did, I took the 4 areas where the tires touched. And then, in the upper left-hand corner, I had taken the black plus sign, and then I started building my grid. I just put 4 basic points down, and now I'm pulling out these handles from the side. You can see already, and you could have seen this just from looking at it from the beginning, that when you have these low 3/4 angles, such as this vehicle was shot at, it's very forced. The perspective is very exaggerated, and although it is realistic, it's a bit weird. Get more to that in a second. I can show you here the red. The reason I took this into the red is to show you that the mathematics behind this, the Photoshop will tell you if your perspective is impossible or oddly forced. When it's in blue like this, you're in a good place, or at least a fairly realistic place. Right now I'm just tweaking this and I'm expanding this to get an idea of where my perspective truly sits. I may have to adjust it a bit just to kind of get a feeling for it. The forced quality of this vehicle is making this grid feel weird. It's going to be that way, but this is the perspective that we are dealing with. So it's important to remember that when you're dealing with angles of what car you're going to start with or what subject you're going to start with, that the perspective will be helpful and not a bit on the hindering side. This one isn't horrible, but it is a bit awkward. Alright, just kind of getting this tweaked. You can see as I've been doing this that once I have the perspective in place, if I grab the corners will adjust the perspective itself. But the edges, the handles and the centers will allow the perspective to remain. I can just expand it and pull it and stretch it so that it remains in perspective regardless. Okay, these areas I'm showing you down here, the grid itself is a bit tight. You can see how dense and blue it gets on the top and how open it is on the bottom. You can adjust that with the grid size up here in the corner where currently this is 1,000. Alright, let's do this real quick. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Using the same plus sign tool that's in that bar, if you grab any of the side handles once the grid has been built, you can simply pull up or down or whichever direction you need to move, and it will continue building grids that are within the perspective that you've already established. Now, it's worth noting that this is all built off of the original trapezoid or the original grid that we had first put down. With that grid in place, everything else is built around it. I will not be able to adjust the overall perspective on everything unless I grab individual angles on individual corners, which is sort of defeating the purpose of this. Alright, I'm just kind of playing at the moment. And you'll see that when I have a new grid that I'm building, all the others go white. There's no more lines inside. You'll bring those back. All you have to do is simply click on that particular trapezoid, that particular field, and the points will come back. Alright, so here we go. I'm just building something kind of abstract here. Don't want to get too complicated. You can see there's a little bit of an overhang here in the corner where the back wall and the ground meet. We'll take care of that later. Right now, if I simply do nothing more than click OK, back in traditional Photoshop mode when it comes back into the canvas itself, just kind of waiting here. This is a lengthy process. Nothing will happen. You'll see that we built that fancy grid and now suddenly it's nothing. That is a bit confusing, and the reason it's confusing is because Photoshop didn't do a very good job of explaining itself here. I'm creating a brand new layer real quick, and the reason I'm doing that, if I go back into the vanishing point filter, wait for this to load back up. Okay, my grid is still there, so that's good because I don't have to redo everything. But over here, there's this little tiny drop-down menu that hides itself from you. You want to turn on Render Grids to Photoshop, and then click OK. When you do that, anything that you have gridded up or drawn with the grid tools will now physically render to whatever layer you've got selected back in Photoshop. So I created that base layer here, which is an empty layer, and now here's the grid. Pretty neat. It's a bit pale. Even on high def mode, it's going to be really hard to see. You can really only see it where it gets thick towards the furthest points in the perspective. So I'm just going to once this is set, I'm going to go over here and duplicate this layer simply by dragging the layer on top of the new layers icon. Just about 3 or 4 times. And when I do that, you can see my lines get thicker and darker. The smart thing to do would be to simply merge them. But if you do that, then it goes right back to that impossible to see blue line. So I simply just throw them into a group. You can do that by hitting Command G when you've got all the layers highlighted together. And this gives me a nice little group.